Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq, with daily insight on the Nasdaq-100 Index, or the NDX, which is made up of 100 of the largest domestic and international non-financial innovative companies listed on the Nasdaq stock market. The NDX has been the barometer for U.S. large cap growth and also one of the best performing indexes over the last decade and a half, not to mention one of the most liquid index ecosystems in the world. Joining me this Friday afternoon, we have Ben Jones, Product Development Specialist with Nasdaq Index Research. We are going to take a look at some Nasdaq Dorsey Wright charts this afternoon and discuss participation and breadth across the market with the Nasdaq 100 and the value rotation we saw this week. Ben, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Trade Talks. And let's take a look at your first set of charts here, again, courtesy of Nasdaq Dorsey Wright.
Yeah, I felt it would be wise to show some of these charts because you know, Dorsey Wright, they know rotation better than probably anyone in this business, and they have a lot of tools on their website for advisors. So definitely go to dorseyWright.com to learn more. This is a week that has been defined by rotation, right? Whether you want to talk about the election or whether you want to talk about the markets. And what's really interesting is you think about how we started this week on Monday with the news of a coronavirus vaccine or potential vaccine. We started to see kind of a rotation from, let's say, growth and momentum to maybe value, right? And in fact, it was the biggest flip or differential where we saw those areas with high momentum underperform those areas that have been lagging. John Lewis, who's a portfolio manager at Nasdaq Dorsey Wright, said it was the biggest quote unquote momentum crash. And again, that's just looking at relative performance between leaders and laggards going back to data starting in 1989, right? So exceeding some of the momentum crashes we've seen in the early 2000s and of course the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So the question is, Jill, are we seeing rotation continue to today, and maybe will we see rotation continue going forward, right? Everyone's been clamoring, are we going to see a pivot back to value? And so I provided these Nasdaq Dorsey Wright charts to kind of show that, right? These are bullish percent charts. These essentially are tracking breadth and participation within these different categories, right? So we use X's and O's. X's, plots that value. If it's rising, it's going to be in X's. If that value is falling, it's in O's. And what it's tracking is essentially the percent of stocks in those categories that are on point and figure buy signals on the Nasdaq Dorsey Wright system. What you can see is that right now, across the board, across every single value stock, every single blend stock, and every single growth stock on that system is, about over 50% of those names are on a buy signal, right? So you're really seeing breadth across the board. You'll notice on the right-hand side, growth, is a little bit higher than, let's say, value, right? 62% versus 56%. So it shows you that, hey, we see more participation, and more offensive, movement from the growth side of the style boxes. However, you'll notice on that left-hand side, on the value side, that it's in X's, right? We're beginning to see value names participate. And that makes sense, seeing the performance that we saw earlier this week. So it's too early to call, let's say, the election between, value and growth and a rotation. But, we are beginning to see value stocks participate in this market. And that's something that we haven't seen in a while.
All right, let's take a look at your next chart here, too, to get a little bit more insight.
Yeah, and so how does this all play back to the Nasdaq 100, right? We know that the Nasdaq 100 is really the definition of innovation and growth, and really is the benchmark for the modern day industrials, right? So are we seeing lack of participation in the Nasdaq 100 right now? From those companies that have performed well this year, those companies that are oriented to growth sectors, like technology and consumer services and even healthcare these days. And, right now, if we look at the bullish percent for the Nasdaq 100, we see that it's, still in X's, right? Which Dorsey Wright terminology would say in offense. And it has rebounded off of, that October, September low, right? So we have seen positive movement, even when we have seen these growth stock names lag this week. So that's a good sign for growth, right? It's a good sign for the Nasdaq 100. What I think is also important for the Nasdaq 100 is that you are seeing participation from areas outside of the traditional, tech sector, right? And so in the chart, tracking performance, it basically looks at one performance going back a few months, and it looks at the Nasdaq 100, it looks at the S&P 500, and it looks at the Nasdaq 100 excluding those technology names. And what's interesting is if we look today, over these past 3 months, we actually have seen the index that excludes technologies outperforming the S&P and the Nasdaq 100 right now. It's up about 8% over this time period versus 6 for the Nasdaq 100 and just under 6 for the S&P 500. So that's a sign that we are seeing areas outside of technology participate in this market.
All right, Ben, appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.